All right. I think we can go ahead and get started. And if people join us, they can just jump right in. We'll go from there. So thank you everyone for joining us today for this Learning Week webinar on the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, also known as the Triple Nexus. We're really excited to have 3 participants for you today that will be sharing some of the expertise. So first we have Michelle Brown, who's the Assistant Director of Advocacy here in New York. We're also joined by François Guémont from the DRU and by Pascal Reboul from the Expertise and Advocacy Director in Action Against Hunger. Right. So I'm going to hand things off to Michelle. When you want me to switch the slides, just say next slide, and I will manage everything from here and the computer.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So just in terms of structure of our discussion today, I am going to provide a brief overview of the Nexus, and then I will share some of the key findings from some consultations that we did with country directors and other stakeholders within the Action Against Hunger Network. Over the past 18 months, country directors were requesting some guidance on the Nexus. So as part of the process, the advocacy and operations IMGs began a consultative process with country directors and other relevant stakeholders. So those findings will be shared at the end of my presentation. So I'll provide some quick backgrounds on the Nexus. So basically, in the discussions that led up to the World Humanitarian Summit and in the Grand Bargain negotiations about 3 years ago, enhancing linkages between humanitarian and development actors were identified as a key priority because there was a recognition that the way that we had traditionally operated wasn't effective, and we really weren't making big steps, big strides to reduce needs. So in the current context, we are faced with increased violence, increased displacement, increased numbers of natural disasters, and as a result of all this, we have increasing humanitarian needs. And the size of...
Sorry, can everyone please put themselves on mute? Don't get too much background noise, please. Thank you.
Okay, so the size of humanitarian appeals increased over 400% during the past 10 years, and there was a recognition that humanitarian appeals were lasting around 7 years each. But in the midst of all this, the SDGs were negotiated, and the SDGs were a great, comprehensive, rights-based framework for achieving lasting change for people. So people started asking, so how can we achieve these SDGs in these fragile and protracted crises? So the concept of the Triple Nexus was developed. It was first just the Humanitarian Development Nexus, but then peace was added in as in recognition that sustainable change can't really happen without peace. Better linking humanitarian and development activities is a decades-long discussion. I mean, it's not really new, but what is new with the Nexus is the sequencing, as you can see in this illustration on the slide. So basically, the old ways of working was that we'd have humanitarian assistance, move on to reconstruction and recovery, and then we'd have development. While peacekeeping and peace building were happening. So with the new way of working, you have humanitarian activities, reconstruction, rehabilitation, development, and peacekeeping and peace building all happening simultaneously. So that is one of the key changes of this new approach. So we, as a network, we as Action Against Hunger, are still in the process of figuring it all out, figuring out where, how we want to approach it, what our value add is within all of these discussions. And especially because Action Against Hunger is dual mandated, we deliver both humanitarian assistance and also engage in longer term development activities. So within the UN system, the Nexus is referred to the new way of working, and that's, I think, probably the most concrete iteration of concept that we see today. And there are currently 7 pilot countries for implementation, and we're operating in all of them. So Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Ethiopia, Niger, Nigeria, and Somalia. And the key outcomes, or the key elements of the new way of working, are collective outcomes. So everyone's sitting together, identifying a problem, and figuring out how each actor can contribute to these outcomes based on comparative advantage. So it's trying to preserve distinct mandates within this process. And another key piece of this is a multi-year response. So instead of having programming that goes on a 6-month basis, the strategy is more long-term, so you can be a bit more flexible in how you approach this and provide programming. In reality, this is a big wake-up call for development actors, because development actors have traditionally shied away from operating in these fragile and conflict-affected areas. Humanitarians, this is what we do, but development actors have been much less open to delivering longer-term approaches in these contexts. So last fall, we began internal consultations on the Nexus, and I'll quickly go over some of the findings in order to give colleagues a chance to chip in. So what emerged from the interviews with 10 country directors, predominantly in countries that were pilot countries for the new way of working, but also priorities for the European Union, and 23 other staff within the network, is that the Nexus is being rolled out differently in each context, which is really the intent of the Nexus. It's a good thing. We don't want a cookie-cutter approach to implementation. The original purpose of our project was to develop a common position or understanding on how we engage on the Nexus. But based on the interviews we conducted, we're not yet in a position to be able to do that. The interview process did highlight some top-line commonalities, and these commonalities can be used to frame how we engage on the Nexus, particularly at country level, but also at global level, where there's a lot of activity happening. Broadly, country directors want to influence how the Nexus is being implemented at country level, and want to see that the network really sticks to messaging that is positive, so very supportive of the Nexus approach, but that also recognizes some of the potential risks to our programs in the context of the triple Nexus. So I'll just go over a few highlights, and then some of the recommendations that came out. So 80% of the survey respondents have a positive or somewhat positive perception of the triple Nexus. The Nexus rollout is quite unique, and it really is based on how the resident humanitarian coordinator approaches the Nexus. And donors are a bit all over the place in all of the countries that we focused on. Discussions at country level are really driven by advocacy folks, and discussions really haven't filtered down to the programmatic or operational level yet. And Action Against Hunger is participating in discussions on the Nexus in humanitarian country teams and through INGO fora. The Nexus approach offers really good advocacy opportunities, according to country directors, because it expands our advocacy targets to include development actors. Traditionally, we advocate with humanitarian actors and don't really have a huge interaction with development actors. But the Nexus is providing an opportunity to also engage development actors and some of the issues that we are concerned about. And this also includes national governments. Development actors also probably have more influence over national governments than humanitarian actors would. In some cases, the coordination between development and humanitarian, and including peace actors, hasn't really changed or improved. In some cases, it has. But for the most part, the coordination is still very siloed. So humanitarian actors tend to coordinate amongst themselves, development actors coordinate amongst themselves, but there's really not much cross-fertilization at this point. There aren't really any Nexus coordination mechanisms yet. In most cases, the UN is leading the Nexus discussions, which is not surprising. And with the notable exception of Uganda because of the comprehensive refugee response framework that's very much being led by the national government. And in cases where the national government is actually engaging, it seems to be motivated more by a desire for resources rather than a genuine desire to actually improve coordination between the different actors. And in some cases, the country directors have identified more years for multi-year funding. And I'll switch now to some of the risks. There were concerns across the board about how the triple nexus might impact how we engage in principled humanitarian action, particularly in contexts where there are UN integrated missions. There's a sense that while these discussions aren't necessarily new, there is a new momentum around Nexus discussions, and we should take advantage of the momentum because it does provide good opportunities for us to change how we program in order to support programs that are more sustainable and lead to more sustainable change. And there was a desire from country directors to enhance how we engage in these discussions because other NGOs are engaging. They've devoted more resources to the Nexus. And if we don't, then we risk becoming irrelevant. Local NGOs are really not part of these discussions. And there was a desire from the folks that we interviewed to broaden the discussions, to have more of a perspective, to include more of a perspective from local and community-based organizations in terms of how they approach the Nexus and how they want to see the Nexus, and the same with local communities. Communities are not being engaged at all in this process. And with few exceptions, the Nexus hasn't really changed how we approach program cycle management, maybe in the design phase, but in terms of how we implement programs, not so much. I'm going to focus a bit more on this triple nexus because for the most part, there was widespread double nexus, so looking at humanitarian and development linkages was...
Someone.
We're getting a lot of feedback. Could you please mute yourself? All right, great.
Okay. So the support for the triple nexus was much more measured. The peace element of the triple nexus is not well understood at all. And it's something that I think we as a community, including development actors and peace actors, are grappling with. It's just not very well defined. There's a sense that local peace building efforts should be supported, but when we're talking about military action in terms of peacekeeping, the question becomes a bit more problematic. But there was a desire from country directors to better define how we define peace. I mean, is it these peace building actors, or are we talking about peacekeeping more broadly? And I think one of the recommendations that has come out is better identifying how we engage in civil-military coordination structures. I mean, are we engaging? Are we not engaging? Do we have support to engage in these structures? And in some of the contexts where there are UN integrated missions, there was a risk that was identified by country directors that the Nexus is being used as really a code for stabilization. So in contexts where counterterrorism operations are ongoing, the governments were very much supportive of the Nexus to stabilize areas under the control of non-state armed groups. And along with that, just a concern more broadly about how the Nexus impacts our humanitarian principles. So I will leave it there and turn it over to Pascal, who will talk about how the Nexus is being used from a technical point of view in some of our programs.
We're not getting sound, Pascal?
Pascal, you're on mute.
I think
There you go.
it's not François before me. What
Yes.
else?
Okay. Let's
Okay.
do François first.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Yes, I mean, some of the point I will be covered by Michel's presentation. So forgive me if I will repeat some of the point. I think there is multiple nexus, and it's difficult for us to understand which one we are talking about, depending on the circumstances. And clearly, there's one that is an obvious one where we are quite comfortable with, is the humanitarian development nexus. And yeah, no, you can stay on this slide. Yes, excellent. I think, according to our mandate, we are very comfortable to work both on the both side. And so, but the issue is when we are engaged on the humanitarian activities in this nexus framework, we need to be careful that we need to remain principled, unconditional, and based on assessed needs all our humanitarian activities. So it's not because we are engaged on a nexus that we have to compromise ourselves with the humanitarian activities, or the mandate of the humanitarian mandate with our humanitarian activities. I think it's very important to distinguish that. There is another, the next slide, please. The next, yes. So I want to talk about, it's already covered, but this triple nexus, when we integrate the peace and the security aspect component on this coordination exercise. I think it's extremely complex. This one is where we are struggling. And also because we have this 3D policy from the government, diplomacy, defense, and development. It's amazing that France and US decide exactly to have the same approach, and it's very scary. That's why, for me, when we talk about the triple nexus and when we are working in the integrate mission environment, we need to be extremely careful to see how we can engage with this approach. But there is, for me, some opportunities, especially on the protection side, to see how we can be involved on this triple nexus. But we need to be extremely cautious. There is another nexus that I will be categoric that we need to escape. We don't need to be engaged. Is the security development nexus. It's mainly an EU concept, but it's highly politicized and it's linked to migration, with the migration agenda in the EU. And so for me, we need to stay away of this nexus. Next slide, please. In terms of funding from an hydro perspective, how we can contribute to the nexus. So first, for the humanitarian side, I mean, we need to push our dear donors, partner, towards a multi-year funding. It can help us a lot to address correctly the needs regarding at least the humanitarian and development nexus. So we need to push also for the program-based approach, and we need to push for more flexibility, less earmark of funding. I mean, these three elements are key for us, and this is where we want to push with our counterpart on the donor side to help to work better on this with this nexus approach. On the development side, I mean, we already have some kind of gap filling strategy in terms of funding instruments. We have the PROACT, we have the AGIR, and we have the SHARE. It was mainly to focus on resilience. So it was less on the nexus itself. It was more as to fill the gap between the two approaches, the humanitarian approach and the development approach. So again, it's back to this old concept of continuum, instead of the new concept of continuum. The EU developed this trust fund. So we have 4 EU trust funds. It's Colombia, Central African Republic, Africa, and Syria, with the Madad one. This is driven by the development agenda. So it's important for us also that this agenda will focus on the linkage with the humanitarian agenda and not the linkage with the security or peace agenda. So we need to be careful. We tap on this fund. I mean, we receive a lot of funds from them. We need to explore as well, I mean, the funds available at the World Bank. So we start to see how we can tap on these funds as well. And on the UNDP, I will be also, we can tap on, but I will be cautious because the UN management of pool fund is not what we like the most because they cannot support all our costs of operation, especially the indirect costs. They are quite reluctant to support it. So our engagement with this new fund budget line is important in the way of the Nexus approach. So we try to do our best to support SEF network to have access to this fund, but with a clear red lines or cautious when you are engaged with this funding. For specifically on the triple Nexus, there is on the EU side they develop. I mean, they amend an old budget line instrument called the Stability and Peace instrument, and now the way that it has been amended is clearly for them to allow them to support also military operation. So clearly now, for me, this budget line should be avoided at almost any case. I don't think any justification now that they amend this budget line that we have to tap money on this fund. The next slide, please. Thank you. It will be my last slide, and I like to see where with this project management cycle, where we have to work better on this coordination, on this joint initiative, etc. So what we call the nexus with the development actors. And so let me start with the need assessment. And there is, the need, there is no, for me, restriction to participate to a joint analysis. The same thing on the joint assessment of the risk, etc. It's very useful to have different actors around the table and to do it jointly. Doesn't mean that we need to have a consolidated product that where everyone will fit with. This is not the spirit. I think the spirit is to have an opportunity to have overviews from other prism, other perspective. So from my point of view, there is no restriction to participate for this joint assessment on risk and the joint analysis of needs. On the strategic planning side, the EU, for example, decide to develop some joint, joint framework on humanitarian development activities. We haven't yet received a lessons learned of this approach. It was quite new. They started 3 years ago, and I think it's good to test, to try, but with cautious, because a common framework can lead some activities where we can have some concern. In terms of resource mobilization, as I mentioned, the program-based approach can help us a lot to have a common strategy with all the donors on board from the different different sides. I mean, humanitarian donors and development donors. It could be extremely pertinent, relevant to start this process at the beginning of the discussion with donors, and in order to avoid to start with one donor and then to beg other donors to step in. I think this Nexus environment on the donor side allow us to develop our own agenda regarding this program-based approach. So I'm very interested to push all the missions to develop this approach with the donor. In terms of lessons learned, I mean, again, I mean, interesting to have the view of the different sides, different perspective. Always interesting to share. Now, in terms of the information management, I will be cautious to share everything to everyone. I think some key information about the humanitarian activities should remain protected by our humanitarian standards. So we need to be cautious. But definitively, there is some information that should be shared to the development side. To the security side, again, very cautious when it's about the risk of massive crime, massive attack. It might make sense to provide the information in advance, but we need to be extremely cautious because we don't have, I mean, we are not on the driven seat when it's about, of course, peace and security agenda. So in terms of coordination is where I see a very good opportunity for us to do better on the Nexus. We are usually quite involved on the cluster coordination side, and less involved on the sectorial coordination with the government, especially when both coordination structure exists. When both coordination structure exists, usually we are quite involved on the cluster side and not on the other side. And I think it will be extremely useful if Action Against Hunger can help on the coordination between the two type of coordination. Voilà, for me, I give the floor to Pascal, and happy to have this half an hour discussion about the views on the Nexus. Thank you.
Thank you, François and Michel. I see that there are already some discussions ongoing. I will try to be quick, so I will just present you 2 slides, and the other slides could be written afterward. I mean, it's necessary that we have time to discuss together. I will just introduce my presentation, firstly, to say thank you for all the discussion that I had with my colleagues, and especially Marc Secpon for Burkina Faso and Valérie Célon. Indeed, I choose not to present various examples, but to present the time frame evolution, transformation of this Nexus question in Burkina Faso, comparing the REPI 2010 and the actual implementation of, so let's say, so-called Nexus in Burkina Faso. I just want to say a phrase that inspired me, speaking with the previous first minister of Haiti, saying, when the humanitarian people are going to stop to see us as a target, when the development people are going to see how we can develop us, instead us to see us as partners, as counterpartners, as to co-construct, to build together our life together on this earth. This phrase is inspiring, I think, because the Nexus has a very technical aim, of course, but I think it's an opportunity to change the way we interact with the civil society, with the various stakeholders, and especially the way we design and also our programs, and also the question of accountability. I read some documents on the humanitarian sector saying that the accountability is really very little, in fact, when you see what we want to achieve. Okay, have we met Nexus? This is a question also about definitions, and I think one problem about the Nexus is that this word is quite complex, in fact, to understand, and it's like a new word, putting various definitions according to the stakeholders. But what I discussed with my colleagues in Burkina Faso is that REPI was really a change in the way of dealing with programs, with food, and saying that after emergency and during emergency, there is a need to build resilience and to construct in the preparedness, like François said, just at the start. And the climate change is also, of course, a big concern now coming. And Nexus is also a way to tackle this issue, one of the results. I want to present here is that, in fact, REPI was having intervention, nutrition-specific intervention that you all know, I think, quite classic and very effective interventions. And the focus of this program, supported by ECHO, and having a coordination within a platform of NGOs, was firstly to restore the production capacity of the people, and also to protect the living environment of the people, and also to develop the communities through cash transfer, cash for work, etc. And finally, the final aim was to build sort of autonomy and resilience of the people, the local people, through common analysis with the population, and trying also to construct, and I think we have, this is a chantier in French, we have really to think now what are our key indicators that we want to document and what we want to, according to what we want to achieve, of course, within the Nexus. So it was like a puzzle trying to respond to an emergency situation and to, let's say, build the future, and also to reinforce the social cohesion, which is a way also to favorize, to encourage peace and to, let's say, avoid conflict. Please, may I see the second slide and last slide? Yes. And when I now, and this is my own interpretation of the documents and after the discussion, when I see the actual program in Burkina Faso 2008, I see that on the top of this program, the question of the local governance and preparedness and inclusion of people is really at the top of this intervention. And it's not only like it was before, a sort of sensitization of the local authorities, but it's really the construction of a partnership. And what I find interesting also is that the capitalization and the advocacy has also an important role to enhance local participation and accountability of all stakeholders. And talking about this local participation and accountability, I think we have a great opportunity with the core humanitarian standard, and especially with number 4 and 5, to enhance participation and to really engage us through partnerships. Let's say the second type of activities are actually probably much more classic, but in a way they are quite original. For example, there is a nutrition safety net, which is exactly the explanation, the demonstration of what François and Michel said. There are some humanitarian intervention, and there is sometimes a need to provide food, for example. But at the same moment, the nutrition is seen within the health system and within the strengthening of the health system and the construction of a social coverage. So this is quite something new, and we see some other example in Madagascar and in some other countries. The productive capacity is always there, and with, let's say, innovative tools. And the environmental protection with agroecology and water supply has a big place in the actual program. So for me, this is addressing needs, of course, but also rights. Rights for water, for example. We are a member of a coalition for that. And this is asking the question of the contiguity between relief and development, and also participating to peace building, peace, let's say, construction. So at the end of this project, what I see is mitigation, adaptation, and social cohesion. And for me, this is really driving a force for stability and peace. And I propose to stop here. The following, let's say, slides, you will receive them, and I can also use them in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, François, Pascal and François. That sounds really good. So there are additional slides, and if there are some questions that those slides can answer, we'll show them to you. Otherwise, all those slides will be on the recording. So when you have a look at this, you can see them. Let's open it up to questions. I know we've received a couple in the chat, so let me look at those first, and then we can take questions from the audience. Ooh, all right. Here, okay, oh. So from E. Rodriguez, can you clarify what difference you make between the 3D approach, where we need to be cautious but you see opportunities, and the security development approach, where you recommend a no-go? So I think that was for François.
Yeah, I think when we talk about peace, I mean, we all are from the generation of peace and love, so we cannot be against peace. And somehow all our activities are linked to, I mean, to develop a peaceful environment for the communities. So when we talk about peace, I mean, it makes sense for us to be engaged. When we talk about, and because there is this notion of a kind of neutrality for the peace. When we talk about security, I mean, forget the notion of neutrality. I mean, it's about to define who is against you and to protect you against them. So, and then it's totally against our, I mean, the humanitarian principle, and it's where I see the wrong evolution of the way that now we are engaged on the peace activity, on the peace building. So that's why for me, when there is a link between security and development, we need to stay away. And when there is, I mean, a component of peace building, I mean, we need to analyze how we can contribute without compromising our values. I'm not sure that I don't know if Elvira, if I address your point correctly. Elise, it's Elise, no? Or it's Elvira. Elvira, I know.
Yeah, thanks, it's getting clearer. Then when do we situate the stabilization between peace and security?
Well, again, I think when when the peace, when the stabilization is driven by a political agenda, is driven by a government, I mean the host country government, or is driven by an international agenda, I mean, then it's for me it's become, I mean, extremely dangerous for us, because we are losing this neutrality. When the peace building is driven by principle, I mean, to stop massacre amongst communities, try to restore trust between different communities, etc. Is where, with non-coercitive means, is where I see the peace stabilization part where it's compatible with us.
Great, thanks, François. And then we have a rather long comment, but very interesting, from P. Chekuti. I apologize for not knowing everybody's first names. I'm relatively new, but I will get there. I share a quote from Mogherini's speech during yesterday's conference on food security. We need, first of all, the defense community to understand that investing in sustainable development is essential for sustainable security, and we need the development community to also recognize that without traditional security, their work becomes sometimes impossible. If I can put it in one sentence, development needs security and security needs development. Even more than that, I would say that development is a security factor, probably the strongest one, and security is also a development factor or a development condition. So not so much a question as much as a comment, but I would love to know if there are any reactions to that.
I think it's a quote, and Pauline mentioned that is a quote, and I think it's an extremely important quote, because it demonstrates how we can move on the wrong direction when we talk about peace building, and it's very scary to see the position of Mogherini clearly backed by all the main state members of the EU, and this is our reality where we have to deal with. So important to, I mean, to be vocal and to be very clear of what we want in terms of peace building, and what we think is not in our area of intervention. But maybe, Pauline, you want to explain a little bit your reaction on this quote? You're on mute.
Pauline? Can I unmute you? Pauline?
Oui, je sais. Mais...
Ah, there we go. It was just to highlight that during this conference, the peace element was very much understood as security. Yeah, I think that reflects what François was just saying, very much so. Very interesting to see that. There was also a comment from Viviane. We should define a framework to guide the CDs to implement Nexus, or should we let each country free to develop its own strategy engagement plan? Thoughts?
I mean, I can just jump in terms of our plans for carrying forward Nexus research. So, I mean, I think because of the context specificity of the Nexus, it will be necessary in a way to develop your own strategy and engagement plan. But our plan at network level is to work with the operations IMG to develop some guidance. I think right now there's no guidance. So I think we want to develop very broad guidance in terms of how one should engage on the Nexus. So I don't anticipate that it will be very prescriptive, but I think we'll try to identify some red lines and try to offer some concrete recommendations. For example, you know, how how missions should engage in conflict sensitivity. Should it be a requirement for all missions to do it? Francois mentioned that there are discussions around developing some program cycle management tools, which are, I guess, Nexus friendly. So they would frame program cycle management through a Nexus lens. Maybe some guidance on how to regularize our engagement in civil and military coordination matters. How to better include the views of local actors and communities within our Nexus approach. So again, I think that what we will come out with on this Nexus project will be very top line that can hopefully be modified to suit each context, because each context is very, very different.
Great. Thanks.
May I add something to yes, I think that we have the responsibility to together to really propose a framework that will help us. This doesn't mean that the answer, the building of the programs will not be country specific, of course, but I think we need a much better understanding of what we mean with Nexus and the way we want to do it. Talking about tools, I think we have some very interesting tools, for example, for the people participation. You know, the Lincoln CA actually is much more working on the diagnostic issues. We could develop this tool, share it, and also use it as an evaluation tool to follow the implementation of the programs with the community. So this is just one example. And going back to the comment of Pauline, I think that yes, the piece is really linked with security, but what I tried to explain in my presentation in Burkina Faso, it is that social cohesion, working with various stakeholders, with various communities on concrete goods common for everybody, access to resource, is also peace building.
Yes, if I may, I would like to react to the Bibian question, and I think it's a very important question. I mean, why we believe that we have now a new momentum to discuss about Nexus. I think there is now a push from us, but from everywhere, to ask the donor to be able to be more flexible to cover all the needs. And we have struggled many years, I mean, to move from a humanitarian intervention to a development intervention, to have a gap in between, to have difficulties to address the root cause of the malnutrition, for example, etc. So we have a unique opportunity now to develop a comprehensive program to address the root cause of the malnutrition and, I mean, the consequence of malnutrition together. And thanks now, I mean, to this Nexus environment, we have the opportunity to have flexible funding tools. We have the possibility to have donors from different sides to be together and to help us to deliver what we want. So there is a momentum that we don't have to miss. Voilà, just to respond to the Bibian question. Thank you.
Great, thanks, François. Let me just scroll down and see the other questions because there are quite a few coming in, which is great. Thanks everyone for the engagement, but I also want to be mindful of everyone's time. A comment from Stephanie Stern. Going back to the first intervention on advocacy, you mentioned opportunities. Michelle, what would be the main targets and priorities for an ACF Nexus advocacy?
I mean, I think that, I mean, that's a great question, and I think it will depend on the level. So at national government, I mean, at national level, it would very much be, you know, engagement through the humanitarian country team. because the idea is very much that the HDT would lead engagement for the humanitarians, but there is this whole separate development sphere that we don't really have too much contact with. We don't really work with UNDP. We're not part of the UN country team. So I think it's really advocating to become part of those development discussions where we have development activities. And it's very unclear at this point how we can engage. I think it is broadening our engagement with the World Bank. The World Bank is a key actor on this, and I think we as a network, the World Bank is a bit of a black hole for us. And we don't have regular sustained contact with them and don't really have a strategy for influencing how they prioritize programs or issues. I mean, at global level, it continues to be, working with the quote unquote friendly donors to ensure that, humanitarian space is preserved within these Nexus discussions. It's, working within the Interagency Standing Committee to ensure that NGO voices are heard when there are concrete concerns we want to raise about how the Nexus is being rolled out at national level. As part of this process, at UN level, there has been the creation of a joint steering committee. The head of OCHA and the head of UNDP chair it. And there's a host of other UN agencies, including the World Bank, but we have no voice in this. And this is where discussions around the implementation of the new way of working are happening, yet how do we influence how these discussions are happening? So I think that, in terms of how we engage at an advocacy level, there are hundreds of different ways. We just need to, I think as my colleagues mentioned, identify what our key priorities are and how we want to push those forward with evidence from country programs.
Great. We really have 4 minutes left. So a last quick question from Pauline, if we can answer it in 2 minutes, and then we'll have to close this discussion. The last question is about the triple nexus, discussed as a way to link development work to social cohesion and peace building activities, but it does not link well with acute crises yet. How do we address this? The insights.
Maybe one element from my side, not from the DRU perspective, but for my past operation background. Again, it's linked for me to access. Access, how we can change a little bit our approach in terms of access to the community needs. We used to have an approach that lets the access for NGOs to the beneficiaries, and the approach should be, from my point of view, access the beneficiary access to the key social services. And this is where we can work, from my point of view, with social cohesion, peace building actors in order to help the communities to have access to common social services to all the communities. This is another angle. Yeah, just my contribution to this question.
And I would add that, because the Nexus is supposedly context specific, what we've seen, say, in contexts like Nigeria, the Nexus has been politicized. So maybe in these more acute contexts, we could make the case that there should be a focus on principled humanitarian action rather than a Nexus approach during these acute crises. I think the Nexus lends itself well in some contexts. In some contexts, it doesn't lend itself. So, I think we have to analyze where we think we can take advantage of what the Nexus has to offer. And when we don't think it offers us anything, it doesn't offer opportunities for us, then we need to, advocate with the UN and donors to make the case that it's not really applicable. I think, the evidence that came from Mali, from Nigeria in particular, showed that the Nexus was problematic for our programs.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Thank you to everyone for joining. It's been a very informative session. Thanks for sharing your points of views. Big thank you to Michelle, François, and Pascal. The recording will be online. Unfortunately, we have to go because we have an event right after this one.
We don't have 2 minutes more? No, because
I'm
this
really sorry. No, people need the room, but I'm really loving this amount of Learning Week engagement.
We have 4 minutes left. Okay, that's fine. I will write my comments.
It's an emergency situation.
It's an emergency situation. Yeah, thank you, Pascal, for your support. No, but just, I think it's important, and I've seen on the field now that we start to engage with some NGOs specialized on peace building or social cohesion, like Search for Common Ground, Invisible Children, the Center for Humanitarian and Dialogue. And I think this is a very good approach that we can learn a lot from this partner to see how we can be engaged on the triple nexus. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone. Have a great rest of your
Thanks a lot.
day and your week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.